Hey folks, Think Live. Welcome to my little program, my little live stream, my little YouTube for tonight. It's not a typical radio show, so we're not doing radio format, but hopefully you're enjoying these little conversations. Every now and then we'll work our way up. We'll work our way up to doing some grander and bolder things. I want to start with some music. And do you know what goes through my mind? I'm sorry, nothing contemporary goes through my mind, unless you consider your mid 20th century to early 20th century contemporary. I hear in my head like the theme music from Errol Flynn's The Seahawks. I hear it right now in my head because I was just thinking, I wish I had music as I was signing in. And it starts off with that trill, like the flutes, like that up high. And then it goes with the trumpets and the brass and all like dun 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 bum 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 dun dun dun, and it goes on and on and on. So it's great, grandiose orchestration for those old swashbuckling movies of Errol Flynn's. Might be too old to do for theme music, but I'm liking the idea. Rocky, good to see you. It's the big cannoli to Rocky Stucci, the emotional meatball, and June, nice to see you. Oh, you like that I sang yesterday? Trying to think of where I sang. Oh, something with probably something I sang to my. It was the Scottish song. You Take the High Road. Loch Lomond. There you go. So, Mark, good to see you. Joyce, good to see you too. Macabre, good to see you all the way from Osaka, Japan. Nice to have you here. And Michelle, glad to see you. Gaza Cav, good to see you. Gary from Melbourne, good to see you, brother. Glad you're here from all the way on the other side of the earth. What time is it there anyway? It's 9:30 Central American time here. So in Melbourne, it's got to be what, 11:30-ish a.m. tomorrow, Wednesday morning, something like that. So nice to have you here all the way from Australia. And so tonight, I kind of advertised this, and I'm going to be talking about Senenmut. And how many of you here, by show of hands, know who Senenmut is? I know we mentioned him in the Nephilim book. It's Wednesday at 11:32. Yep, you're 14 hours ahead of me. I've got a couple of friends out your way. So it's like, you want to say, hey, do you know my friend Amanda? But that's like a whole continent. So you probably don't. So I talked about Senenmut in the book as being my candidate for the historical Moses. Now, so we're going to talk a little history tonight, but a little mystery from history tonight. Some of you have heard some of this before. You've heard bits and pieces. If you heard the reading of the rise and fall of the Nephilim, you heard a little bit of that. I didn't put a lot of meat on the bones there, but we're going to get into that and dig into that tonight because I think that's an interesting topic. And how many of you are products of having gone to Sunday school or synagogue or some kind of Judeo-Christian setting where you would have learned some of this stuff about Moses, the Ten Commandments, Noah's Ark, all of those things. If you've had that kind of training in your background, that kind of indoctrination, that kind of churchifying, you're going to recognize the stories, and it's going to be a little more meaningful for you because you know what we tend to do when we unindoctrinate ourselves, as Jeff Dougherty would say. We step away, and then we tend to turn off the switch. It's just click. And then all of those past things from those past stories we were indoctrinated to, the faith, the religion, the theology, the systematic theology, we tend to wrinkle our nose at it. I know I do that now. I hear things that were like the kind of stuff we did in our evangelical circles. Let's give Jesus a hand this morning, folks, as we sing the next song, praising Jesus' name. And I hear things like that now, and they make me cringe. Because I think it's because it seems so, I'm looking for a different form of the word indoctrinated. It's so indoctrinated. And that kind of thing really starts to bother me sometimes. But so we tend to turn off the switches when we step out of that. And when we turn off that switch, we sometimes forget that just because this particular denomination or this particular religion has adulterated the story or misused it or misappropriated or mistaught, that it doesn't necessarily mean the stories are false. It's like I always said, I don't want to step on people's religious sensibilities when I talk about these things. But at the same time, I also want you to know that just because we're dissecting the story and stepping away from the faith element doesn't necessarily mean the story itself does not have historical efficacy. And so that's where, and Rocky's so offended. Hashtag offendophobia. So so don't be offended. Don't be too sensitive. If you feel sensitive about this stuff, put on your iron shorts and your iron panties, and we'll talk about this stuff a little bit. I'm open to seeing your comments tonight, as I am every night. I will try to take better care to look over there. Yes, you cringe, Joyce, because you're in the Lord's army. Which Lord's army? Are you in the Lord's army, as we might describe the Lord, under unindoctrinating ourselves, or different kind? So we'll get back to that. So the first thing I want to tell you too is tonight at 11 p.m. Central Standard Time, that's 1 hour and 23 minutes from now, is Rocky Stucci's Situation Room. And I will be on with Rocky live after this show tonight. And so we'll go right from this one to that one. Well, I might give you a little break in there so you can go to the bathroom and stuff like that. Get a new cup of coffee. Speaking of coffee, cheers. Yes, Rocky Stucci needs his safe space. So says Louis Boyce. And he's got safe space and tissues and things like that. So he'll make it the emotional meatball. So come over to Rocky's show at 11 o'clock. That's Central Standard Time. If you're out east, midnight. So technically, it's tomorrow's show. It starts at midnight out east. But here in the central United States, it's tomorrow's show playing an hour early. So it's 11 p.m. here, midnight out east. It's going to be 9 p.m. out on the West Coast, 10 p.m. Mountain Time. And if you're all the way over there in Hawaii, I think it's something like, I don't know, it's some ungodly time, like 6 in the evening. So Rocky's show right after this, The Situation Room. I'm joining him. We're sure to light some butts on fire tonight as we talk and dissect politics and the events of the day. And so stay tuned for that after this show. And that's over on Rocky Stucci's channel. I also want to mention up front here, I would love for you, if you're not subscribed, I think most of you who are here are subscribed, please subscribe to my channel. Then click on the little gray bell that's next to it, and you should be getting notifications for this show, for when I'm coming on. And also, if you would, like the video down below. Like it. If you don't like it, you can shut up. But hashtag shut up. But there is a thumbs down if you don't like the show. But there's a thumbs up. I'd like for you to hit me with that thumbs up if you like what you hear. Here. HEARHERE. So that helps me out a lot here on my YouTube channel. So I'm not into millions of listeners or anything like that. So I'm not making any money on this yet. I'm not even monetized yet. But I know that there are some who come to their YouTube channel. They put out good content, and if their content's good enough, eventually, they're able to support themselves a little bit with it. So there you go. There's it. If you want to see more of the things I write and the things I write about, go to my website. It's just, I think if you go to my main page here on my YouTube, way over on the, I think it's on the right side of the banner, there's a place where you can click and go see my website. You can go see all the stuff I do, from graphic design to illustration work to writing. I have been, as you know, graphic designer, illustrator, designer, photographer, all that stuff in advertising and publishing since really 1977. I'll give you a little bit of my personal background. When I was in high school in 1977, I graduated in 1978. If you ever watched that 70s show, the year they graduated, it's the year I graduated from high school. Well, when I was a junior in high school, we had the big seminary that was attached to our church, the radio station, the high school, the grade school, huge fortress church. And I had put up on the seminary bulletin board that I did drawings and stuff like that. And from art class, they'd always hang our paintings from art class in the high school over in the narthex of the church. And there was somebody that was publishing old theological textbooks. They'd take, books like this, and they'd old 76 years out of print, and they'd cut them apart, rescan the pages, burn negatives, and print them. And so I put up, and they contacted me, had me do some work for them. So my first job as an illustrator and working in publishing was in 1977 as a 17-year-old high school kid. And so then I went on into advertising after that. So what I bring to the table, graphic arts-wise, design-wise, illustration, photography, kind of a jack of all creative trades, are things I've developed over the years working in design houses, advertising agencies, and all of that jazz. So you can go see my work over there on my website, scottallenroberts.com. While you're there, I started this by saying, if you want to see more of the stuff I write about, click on, in the links, my menu, there's a link that says articles. Click on that. There's just going to be a text list of articles. You can click on those, and you can go see them over on my academia page, and it'll take you there automatically. So you can read more of my junk. So there you go. I highly recommend reading the one that's entitled, let's see, it's not Oh Captain, My Captain. It is Oh, the Humanity. Go look that one up and see what you think. All right. Now, tonight, I think I got all my business out of the way. Website, Rocky Show. I'll be on with Jeff this Thursday over at Jeff's channel with the Consequential Rapscallions, I do declare. And we are gentlemen, and we conduct ourselves as gentlemen over there, and that's why the Southern comes on, Reminds me of that line from, if you ever saw Place, I fear I shall never see her again. There's a man there who offended my sensibilities so deeply that I sought to take his life, but better judgment o'ertook me. So that's the quintessential rapscallion, the consequential rapscallion that Jeff and I strive for in our gentlemanly affairs. So that's Thursday night at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. And let's see, there was one more I wanted to tell you. Oh, son of a patriot. If I had all these things in one centralized location, I'd just say, go click here. But Son of a Patriot is my, I think I may have it linked up over at scottallenroberts.com. But you just go over to Etsy, etsy.com/shop/Son of a Patriot. Or just go look it up, Son of a Patriot on Etsy, and you'll be able to find it. And that's where I do all my t-shirt designs, patriotic designs, other things, getting into other realms and things like that. So I've got a good design coming up. You want to talk about Jeff Dougherty talking about We Are Gods? It sounds like old new agey psychobabble that we heard back in the 70s and the 80s. But Jeff's twist on that is very different, and it's very real. So I got a design coming up that I might share with him for a T-shirt about the God within us. So stay tuned for that too. All right, there. I think I've gotten through all my business stuff. Audrey, you missed nothing. You missed announcements. You missed a couple of cool things and blah, blah, blah. You like my bunny and animal illustrations. Thank you. Thank you, June. That is, as a matter of fact, that is sitting right here. You know, I told y'all that I had my very first book was this book that I illustrated with my kids. If you were here last night, and I told you, you know, back in when they were 7, so this is like 1998, we sat on the floor of the living room and we're coloring pictures of the characters I used to tell them bedtime stories about. Just make them up as you go. And I did this illustration for them. And then eventually I wrote the book and got the book published. So this is that illustration. If you had not seen this, that's the illustration that I did for my kids. And this is Tam O'Hare and Horatio McNutt and his young squire. So this is the cover of my edition. It's the second edition of the book. The first edition was red in color and it had the same illustration on it, but it was done in black and white. And as you can see in this book, this was my first book published that I self-published, or my first published story, and I took it and I self-published it as a color edition. So you can see the color pictures are so much nicer than, there's nothing like spending hours and weeks and months doing these fabulous color illustrations only to have them printed in black and white. So this is the Rollicking Adventures of Tam O'Hare. Oh, there's the, you see the centerfold? Ready? There's the centerfold. That's the great sea battle that's going on. And yeah, it's chock full of illustrations. I think there's like 18 illustrations, and all in all, this is Tam O'Hare kneeling before Mary, Queen of Scots. And so it gives you an idea. And but this is the book, The Rollicking Adventures of Tam O'Hare. And oh, as a matter of fact, inside here, in the dedication for my kids, I put a drawing of, it's even in here. Where the hell is it? The dedication, I put the drawing of, oh no, it's not him. Never mind. It's not there. I used to, in the original edition, I had the original marker drawing of William the Mouse, and this was an updated one I put in this book because I updated the book. So there it is. That's the Rollicking Adventures of Tam O'Hare. And you can pick that up. You can go to tamohare.com, get it through my website. That's my son Sam, who is now 18, was posing with his sword. And the dog, I said, hey, you want to be in a magazine ad? So he posed in a magazine ad. And that's the drawing he did of Tam O'Hare back when he was like 5 or something like that. So that's available. The Rollicking Adventures of Tam O'Hare. There it is. Thanks for mentioning that, June. I just veered off on a huge rabbit trail with that. No pun intended. Bunny rabbits with swords. So, so this is buffering 3 and 4 times. I had some problems talking to somebody else on here today too. There's something up with my internet, and I don't know if it's because people have the TV on upstairs. The kids, they go to sleep to the TV sometimes. My wife watches TV up there when she goes to bed. My internet is just kind of weak here. And I've got the door and the wall in between me and the router, so maybe it's that. Hopefully we won't have too many problems with that tonight. So, thank you. Yes, my son is, he's now 18. My older kids, 27, my twin daughters. And then Sam is 18, and then I got my 3 here at home. I was married to Rainey 12 years ago. We've been together about 14 years. But my oldest son is 9, new kids. Then a 7-year-old daughter, 4-year-old daughter. So I got a full house. And so the older kids are already up and out. So there you go. All right. Now, it's 9:49, just about 9:50. I want to jump into this a little bit because I think this is, to me, it's exciting. As I've mentioned before, history opens up the door. And there are some people, like when John and I were working on doing a television show, and it was being presented around the horn, and we called it History Trippers. And some of these, even the History Channel was like, we're not buying history shows right now. If you wrestled alligators in swamps, we'd put that on. We'd do a reality show for you, but we're not doing history shows. But History Trippers, and they said history is just, people don't like that word because they think it's going to be boring. That's the demographic out there. That's the marketing analysis, is that you say history in a show, nobody's going to watch it except Poindexter and Scholar. So now, I don't believe that. I believe people like history. And if you house it properly, you can get people to listen and pay attention and enjoy it. History can be enjoyed, folks. And that's what I try to do. And what gets me going about history is when it opens up a door, turns on a light, and you go, holy crap, I didn't know that. It's like, here's a little fact, biblical history. When people, I talk biblical history sometimes, biblical mysteries, things like that. Even when I wrote this book with John, The Exodus Reality, all kinds of people are like, you can't go by that. That's all unreliable history. It's all fake. It's all fable. It's all myth. It's all whatever, in derogatory terms. And that's where I brought up the point with them. I said, maybe you don't have to accept the faith story to accept that there might be some valuable history there. Just because they were writing about religion doesn't mean they faked the historical events. And there's been so many historical events proven out of the Bible. I think I said while we were reading The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, there was an old world archaeologist who back, I think it was like 60, 70, maybe even 80 years ago, said there have been over 1,500 events of history from the Bible verified by archaeology. So that to me is very amazing stuff. Remember I talked to you about that book about David that was written? King David, the real life story of an invented hero. Meaning the guy was real, but the facts around him were apologetics. They were invented. And some people say they didn't think he even existed. Yet they're starting to unearth all kinds of little artifacts that hailed to the Davidic administration, the Davidic kingdom, to the Solomonic kingdom, things like this. Things as small, just coins. A coin in a city in Israel, in the country of Israel, at an excavation site, they find a coin that has a reference on it to the administration of the House of David. And that kind of thing, people are like, well, it's only one thing. Well, how many things do you need to prove that he was well, maybe he was a fake, 2,000 years ago. Okay, yeah, pull this leg and it'll play Jingle Bells. So, same thing, there was the story of, I may have mentioned this before or not, one of the stories I love to pull out of the hat when people talk about the Bible having no real history in it, is the story of Pontius Pilate. Now, if you're familiar with your New Testament and familiar with the story of Jesus of Nazareth, Pontius Pilate was the Roman procurator or governor of Judea at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And the problem with Pontius Pilate is that down through the last few hundred years, especially when they started doing critical thinking behind all this stuff, they said Pontius Pilate was just part of the Jesus myth. And the reason they say that is because there was no proof he ever existed. There's no proof in records in the Roman Empire that they could find, scant references in literature, and that's about it. Until 1964 in Caesarea Philippi, which is the seat of the Roman governorship in Judea, in Israel. It's it's out toward the Mediterranean from the Sea of Galilee. And Caesarea Philippi, there was an archaeological team, and they were looking for something else. I told this story recently because I remember it as I'm saying it. They were looking for something else, and they uncovered this old staircase. By staircase, I mean, limestone block buildings, all rubble and stuff like that from the 2nd century. 2,000 years ago, 1st century AD. And as they were reconstructing this staircase, they noticed that it was they would reuse rubble back then from buildings that had been torn down and things like that. They noticed there's a cornerstone with an inscription that was one of the used as a step in this old stairway, revitalized rubble. And what it says right on it, and this cornerstone is now in the Jerusalem Museum. It said right on it, Praefectus, and you can see it in Latin. You can even read it, speak in English. Praefectus Pontius Pilatus. And he's dedicating a gymnasium to Tiberius Caesar, called the Tiberium. And this would have been right smack in and around 26 to 29 AD, or CE if you prefer Common Era. That was the first archaeological evidence they had that the man ever existed. And so just because it is a religious story that is wrapped up in a ball of faith doesn't mean the history is inefficacious. So they verified that Pilate, then all those other bits of little history they had started falling into place because they found something solid. So this is what makes this fun for me. This is what makes history fun for me, is finding that kind of stuff out and learning that kind of information. Now, what I want to talk about tonight is I wanted to get to, I entitled this, if you saw the headline for tonight, The Senenmut Connection. I had mentioned that I have a belief that there's a certain man in history that was the historical Moses. And because Moses and his writings, as we talked about in Nephilim, gave us no dates, gave us no names, he gave hints about things, but I believe he deliberately kept back the names because of that Egyptian religious philosophy, spiritual philosophy, that the name grants eternal life. If you turn off the name, you turn off the eternal life. You're not giving life. And I think that was part of why he didn't mention the names. But as we mentioned, also in there are historical pointers in there, or hints that tell you when the whole thing took place. And I believe, I'll cut to the chase and then I'll go back and we'll talk about it. I believe that the man who was Moses, and if you heard Nephilim, you heard some of this, was a man named Senenmut. And Senenmut would have lived around 3,500 years ago, but around 1500 BC, thereabouts. Late, remember you're going backwards when you're doing BCE. So the late would be the Grand Vizier to the Pharaoh Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut was the female pharaoh who had been ruling in co-regency with her stepson, Tutmosis III, who was too young to take the throne. When her husband, her brother husband, sounds Appalachian, I know, but her brother husband died. That's how they kept the royal blood royal. That was the thinking back then. They didn't really realize that, just because he's born with only 3 legs and an arm coming out of his chest doesn't mean there's anything wrong with him. It's royal blood. So, it reminds me that, how many of you are X-Files fans? Reminds you of that one episode of the X-Files with the Peacock brothers. You remember that one? It was banned in some European countries. It's that one with the Civil War family that kept interbreeding all the way through the line. And they had these deformed guys. The Peacocks. I think it's Peacott. The Peacock brothers. And all I remember is them sliding out the armless, legless ma who's been giving birth to all these boys from under the bed on her little roller that she used to roll under her car to work on a car and change the oil. They roll her out from under the bed and she goes, "You're my precious boys." Just like that. And you just kind of got that EBGB feel, knowing exactly what had been taking place in that family for many years. So this is what you got sometimes with a little more lush setting, the royal palaces of Egypt and other countries, where brothers and sisters married to preserve the royal bloodline. And as if it's not obvious as to, here's a go figure for you. Amenhotep II, married to Hatshepsut, was kind of weak and sickly, and he died rather young in his late 20s. And they had one daughter, Neferuri, that also died at about age 16. But she was the daughter of Hatshepsut, Thutmose II. She brought Senenmut into the family to be the royal tutor. And royal tutors back then weren't wet behind the ears school marms. They were generally high nobility or generals accomplished in battle that are brought in as the royal tutors. And you'll find many statues. The one that's on the graphic for tonight's show is a picture of Senenmut holding Neferuri in loving embrace. And there was 9 statues found with him holding her like that. So she brings Senenmut in. Now, let's go through the timeline for a second here. And think of it this way. Moses is a character in the Old Testament who supposedly wrote the first 5 books, led the people out of bondage in Egypt. And at age 80, so says the biblical story. Now you go in your Bible to 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. It tells you that in the year that Solomon dedicated the temple in Jerusalem, it was the 480th year since the Exodus. So we know, I know we talked about this because I brought it up in the Nephilim book, but we know for a certainty within a few years in either direction, Temple 1 in Jerusalem would have been built during the time of Solomon, mid-10th century BCE, making it right around 966 BC is the date they plug in for the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem. First temple, Temple 1. Now, if you take 480 years and go back in time, you end up with about 1446 BC. Now, if 1446 is the date of the Exodus, you'd think you just go to all these chronologies of the Egyptian kings. And you end up with the family of the Thutmosian dynasty. The 18th dynasties, which you're smack in the middle of. You're in the midst of pharaohs named Ahmose, which is Ahmosis. You have Thutmose the first, Thutmose the second, Thutmose the third. Hatshepsut's in there. And then it eventually goes on into Amenhotep and some of these other pharaohs after that. So in 1446, if this was indeed the date of the Exodus, let's see they hit it spot on, and that's it. Not, dates in either direction, whatever it is, right around 1446. Well, that would, if Moses was indeed 80 years old, get a pencil out, draw it on a piece of paper, draw a line, put right in the middle, put 1446. And Moses is 80, according to the biblical tale. He's 80 at the time of the Exodus. If the Exodus is indeed 480 years before the dedication of the temple, 1446, Moses would have been 80. Now, go back in time a little bit. Go back 40 years. Remember, Moses' life in the Bible is laid out in these 3 segments of 40. First 40 years in Egypt, second 40 years in Midian, after he's run away from Egypt, third 40 years, Exodus, to the end of his life. So take him at 80, Exodus. Go back 40 years. You end up at instead of 1446, you're at 1486 BC. And that would have been the date approximately that he fled Egypt. Then go back another 40 years to his birth, would have been right around 1526 BC. Now, those dates on your timeline, you got 1446, 1486, 1526. Birth, leaving Egypt, and Exodus. If Moses was indeed born in 1526 BC, the person on the throne, the king on the throne, the pharaoh in Egypt at that time, was Ahmose the First. I'm sorry, Tutmosis the First. Tutmosis the First. He was the son, or was it grandson? I think he's a grandson of Ahmose the First. Now, I'm going to take you back a little ago. That whole scenario was because several generations earlier, the family of Israel, Jacob was his name, also known as Israel, moved his family to the fertile delta region of Egypt because there was famine in Canaan, where they lived, or what is now Israel. And they brought the family, about 70 to 80 people, and all their flocks, all their kids, dreams for the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh raises him to great power, to abbreviate the story. And Joseph becomes the Grand Vizier of Egypt. And lo and behold, these some 20 years later, he's got his family coming to look for permission to resettle in the Nile Delta region with their flocks. And they think Joseph's long dead and gone. 20 years has gone by. They don't recognize him. And big story there. And finally, he reveals himself to them in the biblical story. I'm your brother Joseph. Dudes, could you imagine what those guys may have felt? They sold their little brother into slavery, haven't seen him for over 20 years, and now they're coming kneeling before him as the Grand Vizier of Egypt, asking for permission to escape from the famine. And here's Joseph says, remember, I'm your brother. I could imagine those guys probably shit a brick. And so the older brothers. So anyway, as the story goes, the big biblical lesson, Joseph says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. I'm going to bring you in. And he says, I don't know if we talked about this in Nephilim. What did you miss? How long have I been gone? Was I gone for a long time? Mark says, Scotty, what did we miss? Really? I got no warnings here that I was buffering. How long was I out? This really irritates me, and I got to find a solution to this. 3 minutes or so. I was talking about Joseph and his brothers. If I start going away, I can usually see. Somebody just said I was gone for 3 minutes. Sorry about that, guys. I can't control it. I don't even know when it's doing it. There's a good part missing because you were gone. Yeah, that's what everybody's saying. I was told I was gone for 3 minutes. So if it was longer than that, let me know. But I was talking about Joseph. And sorry, something is rebuffering with my internet. I do not know why it's doing that. Something I am going to do, though, I'm going to go open up my Office door. Hang on a second. Because I think that might, I might have the signal blocked off a bit. Okay. Office door is open. Okay, let's see if this helps us any. It's buffering again on you. Can you not see me? This is really frustrating me. So, is the video not coming across? It's okay. Okay, good. We're back. All right, I think you can type in here and let me know, and I might be able to see that. But, all right. So I don't know where we left off, but Joseph is the Grand Vizier. He reveals himself to his brothers, and he says to them, you missed the bros selling off Joseph. Yeah, that was a bit back. Sorry. Now somebody's saying there's no video and buffering. This is frustrating because I don't know what you're hearing and what you're not hearing. I can't see here what's going on with my internet. It says I'm here. It says I'm up and running. Okay. You see me. Mark said, just said before you, Audrey, that he couldn't see me, so that it's buffering. So what do I know? Okay, you can hear me. All right, and you see me. Well, anyway, let's move on. Just let me know. If it's doing that, let me know. I got to see what's going on with this. Not sure why my internet is constantly doing this. It does it when I'm on Rocky's show, too. So it's not supposed to be doing this, so I have no idea. I'm frustrated. It pisses me off when it does that. And it gives me no signal or no indicator that this is going on. All right, here we go. I'll stop pissing in the wind. So Joseph invites his brothers. He tells them this is a clue as to the time period that this took place. Joseph says, when you go into Pharaoh to ask for this land, he says, tell him that you're shepherds and that you've been shepherds since the days of your youth because the Egyptians hate shepherds. And I thought, why would he be telling them to go into the Egyptian Pharaoh and say we're shepherds to try to win favor because the Egyptians hate them? That made no sense to me. That's right in the biblical passage. Until you think about the time period. If Moses was indeed born in 1526, and he was born under the reign of Tutmosis I, whose grandfather ousted, Ahmose I, ousted a group called the Hyksos that had divided Egypt, and for 108 years, the Hyksos reigned as pharaohs in the north of the kingdom, up in Memphis, which is just to the south of Cairo, at the mouth of the Nile Delta, and down in the south in Luxor, the Egyptians were reigning. Now, the Hyksos were a people, they used to call them the shepherding kings, these Hyksos. And now they've changed it to, I think they found it means something just slightly different, but it's the kings from the east, the shepherding kings, and so on. And what these Hyksos people were, it was for the hundreds of years that all these peoples from all over the Canaanite region, the Mesopotamian region, Asia Minor, Northern Africa, they would all move into the Nile Delta and graze off of the fertile Nile Delta lands and live there when there was famine in other places. They all infiltrated, so to speak, just by moving in, and back then, it's just like you just move into another town. And eventually, over 800 years, these people kept multiplying, and they worked their way into the towns and the cities, into the civic governments. And it was nothing, I don't think there was anything untoward going on or any kind of subterfuge, but they worked their way in, and these people took over the north, and they reigned as pharaohs for a little over 100 years up in the north. And finally, along came an Egyptian pharaoh, Ahmose I, Ahmose, Moshe. He came along, and he ousted the Hyksos. He wiped them out, drove them out of the land, and then, as the story goes, the remnant of these people, rather than just kill them, pressed them into service, pressed them into slavery, and so on. And then there's all of this that goes on. Now, it's very interesting because in the biblical account of Joseph, after Joseph dies, now Joseph, if he is going to telling his brothers, go to the Pharaoh, tell him you're shepherds because the Egyptians hate shepherds. You know what he's doing? He's introducing him to a Hyksos king. So that period of Joseph had to be somewhere in that 108 years that the Hyksos ruled, because they were not Egyptians. And the Egyptians hated them, and they hated the peoples from Asia Minor. They refer to them as the Asiatics in some of the old writings, the people from Canaan, from Asia Minor, and so on. And so Ahmose ousts these people. Then it says in the Bible that after Joseph's death, it says, a new Pharaoh came to the throne who knew not Joseph. had no regard for Joseph, is what it says in the Hebrew. He's like, who the hell is Joseph? I don't care who the H-E double toothpicks Joseph is. And he said, let us press these people into slavery, lest they rise up against us again with our enemies and again take our land from us. There is a huge historical clue right in the book of Genesis, at the end of Genesis, talking about Joseph, the time right after Joseph. They wanted to press these people into service, these remnants of the Hyksos, these remnants from the Middle East, from Asia, from everywhere that had come in. They're pressing them into service so they don't rise against them again and again take their land from them, which Amos the First had just won back. And so I believe you've got Joseph, who came to reign during the period of the Hyksos, died. His family lived there for a generation or two, because it said long after Joseph was dead and gone, and the new Pharaoh came along, had no idea, didn't give a rat's ass who Joseph was. And he presses them into slavery. All right, so that sets our timing window, because then his grandson is Tutmosis the First, who had a daughter who bore the title Pharaoh's daughter. This daughter was Matkare. And if Moses was indeed born in 1526 under his reign, and this man had a daughter who was 7 to 10 years old, Matkare, known as, by title, Pharaoh's daughter, which was, just sounds like words, sounds like the president's daughter. Is that a title? Not really. It's not like king or queen or princess. But back then, Pharaoh's daughter, that meant the Pharaoh of, or the princess, the daughter of the Pharaoh. And so this is the young woman who I think found Moses in the Nile, named him Moses, and drew him out of the water. And why not? Her father was Moshe, or Moses. Her grandfather was Moses. And then they always put an Egyptian god kind of as the prefix. Tutmosis. Moses. And all these other names. Ra Moses is Ramses. So it gives you an idea. So, Fran, sorry you can't hear. I can't do anything about it. Not sure what's going on with my internet. Very frustrated tonight by this. So just periodically, folks, let me know. Or just type in that window if you can't see or hear me. And I don't think it'll kill the sound. It'll kill the picture and the sound if it's not buffering. So, Fran, if you can see me but can't hear me, it might be on your end. Just check your volume levels. So, and welcome, by the way. So, sorry we're having some technical difficulties that are out of my hands. I don't know what to do about it. So, now we've established Joseph. We've established Moses' birth, who was in 1526. Matkari, I think, was the woman who found him in the Nile. You get lots of critics. Remember, the story says she put him in a basket, floated him down the Nile, and he ends up in the bulrushes where the princess happens to be bathing. And she finds him, takes him. Moses' older sister Miriam is following to see he's in good hands. He ends up okay, and ends up telling the princess, we'll take him and wean him for you till you're old enough to claim him, which she did. And then the story skips 40 years up to when Moses is 40 and murders the Egyptian. Now, so we don't know much about the ensuing years, but we do know that Moses eventually went back to the Pharaoh's household. He was raised in the Pharaoh's household. I don't think there was a big secret, like the movies, always the big intrigue. Oh, he's a Hebrew slave. I don't think it mattered. Remember, Pharaoh was the morning and the evening star. He was a god. His word was it. If he were to say, Moses is my son, even though he was born of slaves, nobody would say, who's to say no to Pharaoh? And so he's raised in Pharaoh's household. And he's raised mostly by Matkare, whose regnal name later, when she becomes royal or becomes the pharaoh, is Hatshepsut. Most remarkable woman. I compare Hatshepsut to Elizabeth I of England, a woman in a man's role. Think of Elizabeth and the establishment of her monarchy. You get the idea, the daughter of Henry VIII. So now you've got this story. You've got this baby born. He's gone back to his mother to be weaned until the princess is old enough to take him. Some people have criticized this story, by the way, historically. Some of the skeptics will say, well, that's just a retelling of the story of Osiris, when Osiris was cut up into pieces, floated down the Nile in baskets. And I'm like, it's nothing like that story because nobody was cut up into pieces. But I said, if you want to use that, have you ever considered for a moment that the Hebrews, the Israelites, living in Egypt at this time, had been there for several generations? They're Egyptianized. You think that they were Jewish? They weren't, because there was no Judaism established until Moses codified it when he was in his 80s. So there is a Jewish form of a Judaic form of religion, Hebraic. But a lot of these people, if you look at the way they complained, remember after the Exodus, they go out in the wilderness, always complaining. Complain. Why'd you take us out here? What do they do when Moses disappears on the top of the mountain? They ask Aaron to make a god for them, one of the Egyptian gods, the golden calf, Hathor. This is how Egyptianized they were. And so I think Moses' mother, most probably, in my opinion, it wasn't a false story that was made to look like what happened with Osiris. I believe that she knew the story of Osiris, and she was playing into the beliefs of the Egyptians and of the young princess. She wasn't sure the young princess was going to find him, so she's playing into Egyptian spirituality by putting the baby in a basket. And I don't think she floated him down the main expanse of the Nile. I think all of this took place in the northern kingdom, the northern palace, and there's evidence for this at this time period, that they lived much of the year up in the northern palace, up in Memphis. And from Memphis, all over that part of the delta, there's the canals of the kings of Egypt that were dug. And they would sail their boats back and forth. That was their highways that we have today. Their highways were these canals that were dug all over the place. And so I believe it's very possible she may have, it says that she set the basket amongst the reeds on the Nile. And this is where Pharaoh's daughter found him. And I believe she knew exactly who was going to find him, because she didn't just float him down the Nile. She left him in a place where he could be found in a basket. And that place was the bathing pool, connected most probably to the canal, the royal canal of the pharaohs, by the palace where she found this baby. And then when she takes him in, it's all quiet in the biblical story after that. But then you come to Senenmut. Now here's this character, the Senenmut connection to Moses. The dates, first of all, seem to kind of fit. It is said of Senenmut, who was part of the royal household of Hatshepsut, who is Matkari, who was the young girl, I believe, that found Moses in the Nile. The dates fit. He was brought into her household to tutor the young. And remember, I said tutors back then were either high nobility or military, accomplished generals in the military, things like that. And so he's brought into the household to teach the daughter and to take care of the daughter. Kind of like the daughter's grand vizier, the prince's or princess's grand vizier. And all we know about Senenmut in Egyptian history is this. For as great a man as he was the grand vizier, which means Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh. He had 92 royal titles bestowed on him. He built structures all over Egypt. He built Hatshepsut's funerary temple of Deir el-Bahri and many other places. This was a guy who was greatly accomplished in Egypt. But what Egyptian history tells us is that he was born to commoners. Could that be a softer way of saying born to slaves? Or were the slaves not really slaves? They were like the lower classes that had been indentured, and they were considered common. So Senenmut, one of the greatest figures in ancient Egyptian history, who was not a pharaoh, a great builder, grand royal architect, high priest of Amun, given the title by Hatshepsut of hereditary crown prince of Egypt. This guy, it says, was born to commoners. Now, who are the commoners? Slaves? Were they servants? Who knows? It doesn't spell it out. But we also know that Senenmut's name by Egyptian history meant something. There was a meaning to it. Senenmut means mother's brother. I, your mother, am bestowing on you the right to be a brother to the gods and equal to them with me. You are now my brother, mother's brother. And this is the name that he was given. So what does this mean? Does this mean that Hatshepsut perhaps once held the role of mother to this man, and she elevates him to brother, mother's brother? I'm elevating you to the status of brother to the gods with me. And so this is what Senenmut means. And so you've got his name, his birth, a couple of things that start to indicate something. But then all of a sudden, here's Senenmut, all these accomplishments, all these royal titles bestowed on him. What happens to him? Right around the age 40, the guy just disappears off the scene. Gone. He left 2 glorious tombs. One of them, if you look at the graphic for tonight's show, it's just in the background. I don't have any way of putting pictures up yet, but one of the graphics, or the graphic I have there, you'll see in the background, it's part of the tomb paintings on one of his tombs. And it's a calendar, an astrological calendar that is incredibly accurate and still accurate today, if you look at it. A glorious piece of artwork in mathematics on the ceiling of Senenmut's tomb. But it was unfinished, never used. He had another tomb, unfinished, never used. So the big question out there in secular Egyptology is, we've never found Senenmut's body. Could it be that because the dates fit and all these circumstantial bits of evidence start coming up, is Senenmut actually Moses? And when Moses disappears from Egypt at age 40, it's because he killed an Egyptian taskmaster. The biblical story said he shows up. I know we talked about this in the reading of Nephilim when I covered that chapter, but he saw him. So one of Moses' greatest sins was arrogance. And why not? He's raised to be a pharaoh. I believe Hatshepsut was grooming him to be her replacement. But she's only 9 or 10 years older than he is, something like that. But he's being groomed. He's the Grand Vizier. He's all these things she made him. And his education was in the ways of Egyptian royalty, in the school of the nobles, and he operated as the right-hand man to the pharaoh, Hatshepsut. Now, what's interesting is that he disappears, but right around the same time, so does Hatshepsut. She dies. And so he's gone, she's gone. Who comes to the throne but her young stepson from her husband and a harem wife, Tutmosis III, who was 3 years old at the death of his father when Hatshepsut reigned a co-regency with him for about 6 years, and she took over. Now she's dead, He's right around 29 years old, thereabouts. He takes the throne of Egypt, and he starts striking off her images off of her temple walls at Deir el-Bahri. You can still go there today. You would see this outline of the pharaoh sitting on the throne, and it's all meticulously artsy. It's all chiseled out, and it's still there. Just her images are just chiseled out. That was erasure. That's what they did for him to establish. I'm the pharaoh now. We were co-regents. My stepmother was a peaceful time. He was in charge of all the armies up in Memphis. Never let an attacker or revolt against her. She dies, that we know of. She dies, and he becomes pharaoh. Strikes her images off the walls. Leaves off. He's made his point. He's pharaoh now. He rules for another 40 years. So he's pushing 70, which is pretty old back then. But he becomes sickly. He becomes co-regent with his son, Amenhotep II, who, when he becomes the pharaoh co-regent with his father at age 18, his father dies a few years later. And I believe Amenhotep II is the pharaoh of the Exodus, which is 40 years after Senenmut would have disappeared. According to the First Kings, the dedication of Solomon's temple, the 480 years back from that date, 1446 was when Amenhotep II was 23 years old, sitting on the throne. And he'd had 5 successful military campaigns prior to that. Then many, many, many years went by before he had another military campaign. So I believe the facts, what's the word I'm looking for? Conjecture, speculative history that I put together matches these dates. Now, it's interesting. I had one Byzantine priest that, if you heard Jeff and I on Consequential Rapscallions a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about a Byzantine priest. That was last week. That was kind of a pain in the ass. And he took me to task over this book and said how foolish my theory about Senenmut was. It was foolish. It was, what thumb did I suck that out of? And so on. But then he offered up some other scholars' alternate theory, which the only difference was, he said, I think Senenmut was killed by the Moses character. So he links the same two together. I believe Senenmut murdered an Egyptian taskmaster because he was trying to establish himself as the deliverer or the king, if you will, of Israel. And he was given a lot of leeway until he murdered somebody. Well, then he runs off, remember, disappears for 40 years. And because it says Pharaoh's going to take his life. Who's Pharaoh at this time? Is it still Hatshepsut? Or is this about the same time at Hatshepsut, or right after Hatshepsut's death? And you've got Tutmosis III coming to the throne, who's going to wipe out her faction, if you will. I think there was factionalizing, things going on. I don't think, and it could be that Pharaoh himself never really cared that Moses killed someone. It may have even still been Hatshepsut. We don't know exactly the precise dates. But somewhere in there, she dies, the stepson takes over, or one or the two of them is on the throne, and Moses runs because it says Pharaoh was going to seek his life for taking the life of this Egyptian. So something's going on there. I see it as political intrigue. Remember I mentioned how I thought that Hatshepsut was an awful lot like Elizabeth I, that there were all these factions going on. Remember Norfolk and Dudley and all these guys that tried to establish themselves either as kings, this factionalizing in Elizabeth's court. I think you had the same thing probably going on in the Egyptian court, where you had the son, who's the rightful pharaoh, who's now an adult, has the armies, but hasn't made any moves against his mother, his stepmother. She's alive. She's the pharaoh. Life must have been pretty good because there were no moves. But I'll bet you anything, all the people that would succeed if he gained the throne and so on, I'll bet you there were factions all over the place. And when somebody heard, I'll bet you, keep in mind, remember, Senenmut was also, one of his titles was the Grand Royal Architect. And who did the Bible say that Moses murdered? A taskmaster. Now, here's my question. Do you think that perhaps Moses, as Senenmut, Grand Royal Architect, killed an Egyptian taskmaster on one of his building projects that was beating a Hebrew slave? It's very possible. Might have been someone a little higher up the chain. Excuse me. We don't know for sure. We don't know any of it for sure. So this is my speculation about Senenmut, that Senenmut was indeed Moses, the historical Moses. The dates fit. You don't have to twist history to make it fit the biblical story, which is the wrong way to go about it anyway. History is history. If anything needed to twist, it would have been the biblical story. So everything seems to match up. The dates match up. The events kind of match up. Senenmut flees Egypt, runs to Midian, which is out in the Sinai somewhere, marries the daughter of a high priest out there. Not a Jewish high priest, because Judaism doesn't exist. Pagan religion. Where do you think Moses got all of his information when he wrote the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy? He created Judaism out of whole cloth, folks. He created it, encoded it, because he pulled in all these elements of things he had already learned from all these other religions. Growing up, the first 40 years of his life in Egypt, in Egyptian religion and spirituality, as a young man in the school of the nobles, and then out in Midian, married to the daughter of the high priest out there. So, and you know what? You don't just get to marry the daughter of the high priest because you're some bumpkin who stumbles in shambling out of the sand in the desert. I think he was very princely. I think he carried himself well. I think he had a backstory that people knew. I think he was given shelter. I think he wasn't just a shepherd boy. I think he became a sheikh out in the deserts of Midian, in the Sinai. According to the Midrash, Jewish writings, traditional writings, Moses, after he fled Egypt, first went south, down to Cush, which is Ethiopia. And he went there, and he married a princess, and lived there for a while, then took her and fled to Midian, where he also married Zipporah, the daughter of the high priest. So, remember, there was a story, I may have told you this in reading Nephilim. One of the other stories from the Midrash is that Moses, when he was in military service to the Pharaoh, was a general, and he led an army down into Cush to subdue a rebellion, killed the king, and he took the throne for himself. And Pharaoh said, no. Get your butt back to Egypt. That's mine, if you seem to forget. Hightails it back to Egypt. Well, he goes back down there and marries the daughter, the princess, and takes her with him, goes to Midian. You don't hear much about Moses having two wives, at least not in Christian theology. You go into the Jewish writings, and he did. So, supervisors, yes, taskmaster, true translation. It's a supervisor, Audrey. Mark's right on that. So here is the story. Here is Pharaoh, or I'm sorry, that he was the Grand Vizier, and that Senenmut was Moses. I always leave that 2% because I'm not so arrogant as to say I may have gotten something wrong, may have miscalculated, there might be facts there I'm missing, but it all seems to pour together into a very cogent story that fits the dates. And I know John Ward and I, when we wrote this book, The Exodus Reality, we had asked David Roll, Dr. David Roll, to write the foreword for us. He says, well, let me look at your book. And then we sent him sections of the book because it wasn't all done. He said, I can't possibly write a foreword for you. You're just wrong. Flat out wrong. Like, well, sorry, dude. And I said, we don't have to agree. You don't have to agree with us to write the foreword to know we've done good work. Oh, well, you're not an academic either. I'm a PhD and you're not. I can't condone a book that has, and I agree with that to a certain extent, by the way. One of my own seminary professors, who places the same dates on Moses, thinks my theory about Senenmut is a very good one. He's an Egyptologist. He was my former seminary professor. He taught Egyptian history, Israelite history, and he thinks I'm pretty close to being spot on the mark. Wasn't sure. He said it sounds almost too romantic to make it Senenmut, but I think it's just a story, just like Queen Elizabeth. It's a story that fits, and even he couldn't write a foreword for me because he said, well, you're not an academic. You don't have the letters behind your name. And he said, I really couldn't. It's really against ethics to be able to write a foreword for you. But he liked the book. So there you go. So that's my theory. The Senenmut Connection. Was Senenmut Moses? Yeah, I think he was. I believe I told you at least a bits and pieces of the story I had down in Egypt a few years ago, where all of this came pouring in a very paranormal way. And I might tomorrow night give you that story or sometime in the near future. But tonight, let's call it quits there. If you want to get this book, Exodus Reality, you can either write me. I've got a whole box of these from my publisher. It costs a little bit more from me because I have to charge a cover price plus shipping price. So it's $19. You can see right there, $19.99. It's a $20 cover price plus costs about $3.50 to ship it. So if you want one of these and want me to inscribe it for you, send me an email and I'll get you one. And you can PayPal me, or you can just go on to Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble. They're everywhere. Books are sold. You can sometimes even find them in bookstores, Barnes and Noble stores, things like that. And you can pick that up if you want to read more about it. And John Ward also has his theory in there. His theory is a different guy, but very close in the same time period. He's got a good theory, but as I told him, I said, what do you know? You're just digging the sand. I read books. Oh, by the way, when we were signing a book for a friend, he wrote all the way back here, the last numbered page is 285. And after that page, on the blank page, he writes 286 at the top. And then he said, Scotty's Senenmut theory, and puts a little question mark right in the middle of the page. So there you go. That was a joke between John and I. So there you go, folks. Senenmut, Moses. I believe it was him. There's probably a lot more to this tale, a lot more to discover about these people. If you want to read a good book about Hatshepsut herself, and this author doesn't entertain this theory at all, but she does believe there was connections. There was obvious connections to Senenmut. As a matter of fact, they thought that Senenmut and Hatshepsut were lovers all through her reign. He was like the Robert Dudley to Elizabeth. And you can go up above in the caves up in the hills up above her temple and find old tomb painting or shrine paintings from 3,500 years ago of Senenmut shagging Hatshepsut, stuff like that. So they knew about this stuff all back then. And by the way, kind of a neat little story to close this on. They eradicated all of her images off her temple, all of Senenmut's images 40 years later, buried his statues. But there's one place in the temple where they didn't see. The Holy of Holies in the temple of Hatshepsut had these big doors, and they would swing open inward into the Holy of Holies. And they were on big stone hinges. When they were closed, of course, you couldn't see anything. Senenmut had on the inside of the door frame on the wall, way down at the bottom on the floor, on both sides, an inscription of himself with his cartouche, his name, and he calls himself Senenmut, the one true friend to the queen. And it was very sweet language that he used. But they missed it when they eradicated his images, because the doors, when they're open, cover it up. When they're closed, of course, nobody's in there. So they got missed and they're still there today. You can go see them today. And when he made his tomb outside her temple, where I had that experience I had, you're facing her grand, glorious temple, and down in the ditch, kind of down the cliff a little ways, up in front of the cliffs, is Senenmut's tomb. It's very interesting. If you go on the other side of the ridge to the Valley of the Kings, is Hatshepsut's tomb. And if you were to take her tomb way over in the Valley of the Kings and his tomb, and turn it sideways and do a cross section, you've got her temple, you've got the rocky crags, the Valley of the Kings over here. Senenmut's tomb is here. Her tomb is over here. But the way he built her tomb, and he constructed his own, underground, they do this, and they go all the way, and they meet. There's just a stone wall in between them. He made them meet. So, very interesting. There was a good love story there. So, there we go, folks. It's now 10:51. 9 minutes until the Rocky Stucci show. I got to go splash water on my face, drink some more coffee. Maybe I'll put on my hat. Hope this doesn't offend anybody. If it does, I don't care. That's for Rocky's show. So we're going to go on. We're going to talk a little politics on Rocky's show. He hit it hard. So let me go splash water on my face and drink some coffee. And I'll see you over there in about 10 minutes if you want to join us. Thanks for listening in, folks. I love you. I appreciate your being here. Like this page. Like this video. Subscribe to my page. Go see my shit on my website and all my stuff. And we'll see you tomorrow night with some more fun stuff to talk about. Talk to you soon. Thanks for being here. Good night.